always like pictures to help me talk. So I'm going to share just a couple sort of slides. Can everyone see this okay?
Yeah, we can.
All right. Hello again. Yeah, John, thank you for that introduction. I might steal that slide myself. I love it. Such a perfect encapsulation of sort of the repeat process we do. So yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit more, as John said, about the process really that we've gone through with this data. And yesterday I showed this diagram of thinking of the scientific method as an ongoing process where we're constantly reevaluating our ideas for how we think the world works and coming up with new questions. And every answer that we get, usually we realize we have 10 new questions, and trying to prioritize which of those questions can we actually answer and how is kind of a constant conversation that we have. And so, we often start with this first step of just making observations about the world. And so, for the data that you all were playing with a bit this morning about flowering time, that was really motivated by this observation from our long-term study that we saw this tipping point in reproduction. So we saw reproduction going down with really warm temperatures. But, of course, in order to measure plants across this geographic range, we're going from New Mexico, Colorado, two different sites in Alaska, within a limited span of time, we're only spending about a week in each of these locations. And often by the time we get there, the plants have finished flowering, and that's why we're able to count their fruits. So to get a measure of how many seeds they've been able to make. So it felt a little bit like a black box that we saw this decrease in reproduction, and we couldn't say necessarily why. Was it something about pollinators? Were the plants just making fewer flowers? What was happening? And so for that reason, that motivated us to start collecting some more detailed data about flowering and pollination. And we can't, unfortunately, do this across all four of our sites and be everywhere at once. So for this, we've really focused in on Colorado. And that was because at the time when I started this, I was at the University of Colorado, so I was local. And another motivation was that we had some local college students really interested in getting involved in research. And this seemed like a great sort of data set that they could help collect. And so what we started doing is going to these four sites that we have at Niwot Ridge in Colorado, and just measuring when plants started flowering. And even though these sites are located relatively close to each other, they're all on this ridge, they're in slightly different microhabitats that affect their climate. So, for example, this site SN1 is on top of a really exposed ridgeline. It gets a lot of wind, and so it doesn't accumulate deep snowpack. So snow melts out pretty early, and it tends to be warmer and drier in the spring. Whereas this other site, SN3, is in this sort of protected little hollow, and it accumulates a pretty deep snow bed there. So snow tends to melt out a little bit later, and it's cooler and wetter in the spring. And so even with these four sites, we're able to get sort of a range of climate conditions. And then when we do it over multiple years, we see even more variation in climate. But I just wanted to show that the whole reason we have this data set is because of undergraduate students that have been involved in getting independent research experience and helping to collect these data every summer. And so to get 6 years of data, we've had a lot of different college students involved in that work. And it's just been a really fantastic opportunity to get to work with them. I also just quickly wanted to show, you all have been working with a fairly aggregated data set to make it a little bit more manageable. So I wanted to share what the raw data that we're actually recording in the field looks like. So for every individual plant, we're going out every 2 to 3 days and counting how many flowers are open on that day. And so this is an example for just one of our plants, number 408, what that looks like in each of those 6 years. And so we see this really nice curve where the plant doesn't have any open flowers. All of a sudden it starts flowering and it makes more and more flowers, and then it stops flowering. And so from this, we can calculate things like the day of first flower, which is sort of the variable that you all have been working with. And that makes it a little bit more manageable to think about analyzing or looking for general patterns. So with our process with this, I mentioned that we really start off working with college students, and after the first 2 years, we decided that we thought we could say something about how this plant was flowering in relation to climate. So we had 4 sites and 2 years, so that gave us 8 data points to look at average flower time against the timing of snowmelt for a particular site and year. And so we published this paper with 4 of the undergraduate students, Elijah, Lucas, Grace, and Ellen, that had collected that data over those 2 years. And this is the graph that's in that paper where we have the average day that a plant started flowering, made its first flower on the y-axis, and then the day that the snow melted in that site and that year on the x-axis. And what we say in this paper is we say that, we see that this plant is flowering earlier when the snow is melting earlier, but up to a point, it looks like that relationship sort of flattens out as we get early flowering. And we speculated in this paper, well, maybe there's some limit to how early this plant can flower when the snow melts out really early. But luckily, we had another college student who wanted to continue expanding this the next year. So we were like, okay, we'll get one more year of data. And it ended up being a year with really early snowmelt. So we were excited about that. And when we got that third year of 2018, those are these diamond-shaped points here. You can see that our previous idea of this like being a flattening relationship was completely gone. And now it looks much more just like a straight line, really, where we see that plants are, in fact, flowering early, continuing to flower earlier when the snow is melting earlier. So this was intriguing. So we decided, let's keep going. And we had 2019, which ended up being kind of a late melting year. And we got 4 new data points out here. So we actually observed some of the latest flowering that we had seen so far in that 4th year. And at this point, we were addicted. So we were like, let's just keep going. And then we got this data set in 2020 that completely threw it out the window. And I think you all may have noticed this if you were playing around with the data, because up until this point, I was all ready to write a follow-up paper saying that, flowering keeps happening earlier with earlier snowmelt. And then 2020 ended up being a really, really early melting year. So we had some sites melting very early in the year, but surprisingly, they did not flower as early as we would have predicted. And in fact, they flowered at about the same time as kind of average. And this forced me to really think about what was going on in 2020 because it seemed like such a weird outlier year. And what I did is I went back into the temperature data and I realized that even though the snow melted very early, the temperature stayed fairly cool all that spring. And so I started thinking about how maybe just using snowmelt was a little bit too simplistic for deciding how these plants are deciding when to flower, and that maybe what really matters is not only that the snow has melted away, but that the temperatures are warm enough. And that combination of snow being gone and warm temperatures in the spring is really what's triggering the timing of flowering. And so then we started looking more carefully at the temperature data. So we had one more year, 2021, which ended up being an average year and just kind of continued to flesh out those data points. But because of that 2020 year, we started looking at temperature more. And this is a graph with a kind of complex climate variable on the x-axis called growing degree days. I won't get in too much into it, but essentially what it is it's summing the warm temperatures and also taking into account how early the snow melts. So it's kind of combining information about both snow melt and temperature. But I still struggle to explain what growing degree days are, so we decided it would be easier to just give you temperature and snow melt to play around with because those are pretty intuitive on their own. But yeah, that's just to say that by collecting this data over 6 years, we've seen, we sort of learned that we needed to think very carefully, not just about snowmelt, but also how warm it is after the snow melts. So we did finally, like just recently publish a follow-up paper using the full 6 years of data on this. And that's the data set that you all have been working with. But we are still wondering, why? Why is reproduction failing? And also, is the same thing happening with other cushion plants? And so some of the things we're really thinking about now that we don't necessarily have super clear answers on is one possibility. I just wanted to show this video. This was one of our sites in the early spring where plants had started flowering. We were out there collecting our data, and all of a sudden, this massive hailstorm started. And within about 15 minutes, this is what our site looked like. And the plants that had started flowering early because the snow had melted and the temperatures were warm got absolutely hammered by this hailstorm. And all of these flowers that it had put in the energy to produce were basically destroyed by this hail. And even after the hail melted, the flowers were all beat up and wilted and were not attractive to pollinators and didn't really produce very many seeds. So one thing we're thinking a lot about is this possibility that by flowering really early in the spring, you might be more at risk of these unexpected frosts or hailstorms that could be decreasing reproduction. The other thing we're thinking a lot about is pollinators. So this species is insect pollinated, and you might be able to see this bumblebee here just very quickly flitting around all these moss campion plants pollinating these flowers. They move so quickly, it's hard to really kind of track them. But in the course of just like 30 seconds, it just hit about 6 or 7 different plants. And that's what we see with bees with this species is that they tend to be drawn to places where there are a lot of open flowers, a lot of individuals of the same species flowering at the same time. And so one thing we've been thinking about is like maybe flowering too early in the year, there might just be fewer other individuals around that are also flowering to be able to attract those pollinators in, or the pollinators may just be less available. So where we're at now is trying to begin to collect some new data to try to answer these questions. So we've just over the last, this is our second year now, started collecting flowering time data for 2 other cushion plant species as well, alpine phlox and alpine sandwort. And that's because these 3 species grow very close together. They flower at about the same time, and they're all pollinated by insects. So, you can see here's our moss campion. It's growing right next to a phlox that has 2 flowers open and right next to a sandwort that has about 10 flowers open. And so we're curious, how are these other species changing their timing of flowering in years that are warmer or have earlier snow melt? Are they competing with each other for access to pollinators, or are they maybe helping each other by just creating a more attractive, what we call floral display, just a ton of flowers out there that might be really attractive to pollinators? And we've also started some experiments to try to understand just how important pollination is for reproduction in this species. So this is one of my graduate students, Emma Chandler here, is really spearheading this, where she's designed these little net cages she can put over individual flowers to make sure that no pollinators can visit those flowers. And then she has her controls over here that pollinators are able to visit. And then when she excludes pollinators, some of them she will hand pollinate and some she won't leave with any pollen. And so with that, our hope is to be able to understand what is kind of the natural pollination rate in this species, how important is that for reproduction, and how might that be changing with climate. But we're just at the beginning of starting to collect those data sets. So we haven't even started. We're still like entering the data into Excel at this point. So we don't have any answers, but that's sort of been our process from 2016 to where we are today.
Megan, that is so interesting to hear about from like start to finish here. Your 2016 work, 2017 work ready to publish. New findings, like just motivating and inspiring all the next whatever, how many years now? 5, 6, 7, 8 years of work. And all the twists and turns. Really cool. Thanks for sharing that. I was like kind of right what we're talking about, this process of generating questions, playing with data, generating new questions. There were a couple questions that folks have typed into the chat, but if you have a few more minutes, I think people would love to ask a few questions. And one that came up was from Joyanne, who's interested in figuring out, have you found any specific climate change factors that are tying into what you're seeing in your study?
Ooh, yes, we definitely are seeing that those really warm years, those really early snowmelt years are happening more frequently now than they have in the past. Um, and so, that's a very clear kind of signature of climate change. And I would say that's kind of the main one that we've seen.
Yeah, great. So like earlier snow melt, warmer spring temperatures, and you're maybe not seeing that in this like 6 year data set. You probably need a longer data set to be able to see those trends. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. If we take just our 6 years and you plot, temperature over time, you don't really see a trend of warming just over that 6 years because it varies so much from year to year.
Hmm.
But if we look at really long-term historical climate data, like from weather stations, there's a weather station at Niwot Ridge that started recording the weather in 1950. And so we can plot that, and that's like right next to these sites. And there you can see that over the past 70 years, there has been a clear trend of warming.
Cool. So I think perhaps you're in these 6 years, you can identify Moss Campion's response to these different environmental factors and then project forward what you
Mm-hmm.
might expect. Is that kind of what y'all are trying to do?
Yes, exactly.
Cool. Great. Thanks, Megan. Judy is wondering if all these plants, the phlox, the sandwort, the moss campion, if they're all of similar lifespans.
Mm, that's a great question. We have just started collecting some demographic data on these other species as well. So that's the data like individual survival and growth and reproduction. And that will eventually allow us to calculate an estimate of the lifespan. We don't yet have enough data to do that, but they are certainly very long lived. We don't know if it's 100 years or 300 years, but they're similarly slow growing. And so the fact that we see such large plants tells us that they also have long lifespans.
Great. Anybody else want to pop on and ask a question directly to Megan or anything else in the chat?
What makes you excited or love the research that you're doing? What's your high on it?
Oh, that's such a great question. There's sort of two things. One is that, these are just beautiful places, and every single year I have a moment like, I can't believe this is my job to be up here in an alpine meadow full of wildflowers. I feel differently when it's like I'm being hailed on, but it's just a beautiful place to work. But I think more deeply, what really hits me is just how long-lived these plants are, and realizing that the vast majority of these plants that I come back and visit every single year and measure were alive long before I was born, long before my parents were born, potentially even before my grandparents were born. And so it feels like we're really sort of being historians for these species. We're documenting what they are doing and how they are being affected by global climate change and telling their story. And I always feel really honored to do that and just recognize that, all of the things that they have seen in their lifespan, and many of them will still be on the ridge long after I'm gone. And so that really feels like a privilege to me.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks for your
I,
question, Shannon.
I have I have a couple questions. I was wondering, like, one is about the flowering of them. So do they just flower like one time a season, or is it kind of continuous or not?
Yeah, that's a great question. They will usually flower for about 1 to 2 weeks, but each flower is open for about 5 to 7 days. So there's a period of time where they're sort of continuing to open new flowers, but it is kind of a discrete period of time where flowers will start opening. They'll have a bunch of flowers open, and then all the flowers will be wilted, and then they're done for the summer.
And then my other question, and I'll just put the two of them together. My other two questions are about how after they do the fruits and the seeds, like how the seeds are dispersed. And then if you're seeing like you're just seeing the reproduction rate go down, but if you're seeing actual adult plants like dying or withering or not, those are my final questions. Thank you.
Those are great questions. So the seeds don't the fruit is sort of like this little capsule, and as it matures it just opens up at the top, so it's sort of like a little cup on top of the plant with seeds at the bottom. And when it's windy or the plant gets disturbed, those seeds can kind of just fall out of the cup. But they're not like, a dandelion or other species that have adaptations for the seeds to really move long distances. As far as we can tell, they kind of just fall, and the majority of them stay very close to their mother plant. But some of them clearly make it a farther distance, and we think that's probably like snow melt runoff can carry them, or potentially even in the winter, wind could be really important. So we think that's sort of the majority of how they move. And then the question about survival. So I don't yet have the data for this because we have been so slow to update our analysis of survival. So we have all the data, but we just haven't analyzed it yet. But I have noticed much higher adult mortality rates, especially in the last couple years. So we haven't yet sat down and crunched those numbers, but it is a goal for us to do soon. But my guess almost certainly is yes, that we are also seeing adult survival going down in the same way that we're seeing reproduction going down.
I have a
And kind
follow-up question real quick if I can jump in for Megan. So I spent a lot of time up in Glacier National Park in the Alpine just last week. I just happened to notice a lot of the moss campion were flowering and other ones right next to them, some very large. have no evidence of flowers or stalks or seeds or anything. You're just grain cushions and with nothing on them. Can you explain that a little bit? Is that just, are they not reproducing because they're struggling or?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and there's a couple different things going along with that. So one, they have to reach sort of a minimum size to start reproducing. So the smaller cushions usually won't make flowers until they're a bit bigger. But there is variation even within a population. There are some plants that are like we've noticed when we go to a particular site, it seems to be the same couple of plants that are always the very first ones to start flowering at that site, and some other plants that are a little bit later to flower at that site. So we're looking at kind of the population average flowering time in these graphs, but there is some variation among individual plants in whether they flower or not. But also stress does seem to play a role. So we, just sort of noticed that plants that have been shrinking a lot, that have just not been doing very well, will make a lot fewer flowers, or may not flower in a year. So that could be what's happening.
Thanks, Randy.
Thank you.
Megan, maybe do you have time for two more questions? Then we'll keep rolling. There's a question about herbivores. Are there any foraging herbivores up there that might be feeding on these plants?
There are. And that's another black box that we're aware of that we don't yet have good data on. But there are grasshoppers that can eat the leaves, but also can eat the developing fruits and the seeds inside, and that can impact reproduction. My graduate student Emma just sent me two videos. She's out at the Ridge right now. She has a video of some mites that seem to be eating the flower parts, and she's going to collect some data on how much that affects the ultimate number of seeds that those flowers can make. But she also sent me a video of a marmot eating moss campion, which I was a little surprised because I wouldn't think it's quite leafy enough to be that appealing to a marmot. But she saw it happening in action, so we know it at least is possible to happen.
And along those same line, I think in terms of like other organisms up in that space, do you see any invasive species in the alpine tundra?
Not so much invasive species in the sense of like really non-native and coming from a very different place. One of the biggest things that we see is just lower elevation species starting to move up. So sometimes this is talked about as like shrub encroachment or tree encroachment. So I mentioned that we can think of tundra as a place that is too cold, too harsh for trees to be able to survive. But as temperatures are warming, that tree line is slowly kind of marching up in elevation. And so we're starting to see shrubs and trees increasingly kind of encroaching on to tundra.
And Megan, these keep coming in. I may do a couple more, but then would it be okay if maybe we sent you a few questions after the fact to get some answers? This is just really awesome. I think what we may do for this is take your responses to these questions and create some sort of like frequently asked question document to go with these resources. One question that came through from Caroline was, do all flowers produce seeds, and how long between flower production and seed production?
That's a great question. So no, not all flowers produce seeds, and we have done some experiments or collected some data on kind of the fraction of flowers that produce seeds, and yeah, quite a few flowers do not produce seeds at all. One somewhat complicating factor that I haven't talked about yet is that this species actually has two plant sexes. So some of the plants are female, so they don't make any pollen. And some of the plants are what's called hermaphrodites, so that they can make both seeds and pollen. And we know that female plants, on average, more of their flowers end up making seeds. We don't yet know exactly why. In fact, quite a few people have tried to figure that out, and we haven't found a very clear mechanism yet. But that's another thing that my graduate student Emma is studying for her PhD. So there is some variation in how many flowers actually become fruits.
Cool. And maybe the last question, in your work, have you found a correlation between like the growth of moss campion plants and the number of flowers or the number of fruits that are produced?
Hmm. Well, there's certainly a relationship between size and the number of flowers and fruit. So, because these plants just grow kind of horizontally, larger plants just can make more flowers. And so that's one of the reasons why when we look at reproduction rate, we sort of control for the size of a particular plant, because that's kind of by far the biggest source of variation in how many flowers or fruits a plant can make. But we have not yet looked to see if like an individual that grows really quickly in a particular year also makes a lot more flowers or fruits in that same year, although we have talked about it as something that we would love to do with our data sets. That's a really great idea.
Cool. Thanks, Megan. And I know I need to stop, but this is the last question. I can't let Diana leave her hanging. How much engineering design goes into the tools that you use in the field?
Hmm. It's actually incredibly low tech. So we we do almost everything with like a ruler. Like we measure the size of the plants with just a ruler. Fruits, we're just counting. We have like little clicker counters where every time you see a fruit, you click down and then it counts the number of times you've clicked. And we use sort of waterproof field computers or field tablets to enter the data, but often we're just entering it on paper, on clipboards as well. So it really is a fairly low tech project. The most technology we're using are for our climate data loggers. So those are little temperature data loggers that record the temperature every 4 hours, or we have some soil moisture probes that record soil moisture. But yeah, it's all things considered a pretty low tech project, and by far the biggest expense is just traveling to these 4 different locations with our research crew every year.
Megan, thank you so much for being here the last couple days. Megan shared her slide deck from yesterday with me, and perhaps I can request the same again for today. And hopefully the recordings of Megan's talks and these Q&As coupled with the slide decks can be a awesome resource for folks. I know it will be for me as well. So thanks so much, Megan, and you can expect to hear from me again with more questions from this group. And there's some interest potentially in some more speaker opportunities moving forward. So I would be excited to facilitate the connection between some of your grad students and team and some of these educators next year. So thanks so much, Megan.
That would be fantastic. Yes, thank you all for being here and your interest in the project. Yeah, thank you for everything.